Taylor Thomas. Welcome to the Liminal Living podcast. It is great to see you on my computer screen today.
Yep, it's good to be here.
Now, you're in Boston, I'm in Michigan, so we are both experiencing some cold. Now, how cold is it in Boston? I don't know what the temperate weather is like over there.
I looked at my phone. Let's see, it says it's 25, but then it says feels like 16, which I believe because the wind is ruthless here.
Yes, that feels like kills you every time. I turned the heat up in my office because it was on 50 when I arrived, and then I turned it up, and then I went to make some coffee, well actually some espresso, and then I came back and the heat never kicked on, so I had to turn it back on, and my hands are so cold right now. So if you're watching the video, I'm going to be like hugging this cup of coffee with my hands. Well, it's great to have you on the show. We have a mutual friend, Josh Patterson from the Rethinking Faith podcast, and he interviewed you there and then immediately texted me and says, you got to talk to Taylor because I think she's just going to be a great fit for what you're talking about. And that's how we landed here.
Yeah, so, love Rethinking Faith. Love Josh. So
he's a pretty cool guy. I like him too. Well, I just kind of perusing through your socials and your websites and stuff. You have this really cool artistic eye to you, and some of it gets into some I would say like monster genre. So I was wondering which modern day monster from the horror genre is your favorite and why?
Yeah, I'm on a Nosferatu kick right now. Part of it is just because I'm really interested in the Weimar era of Germany, and the original Nosferatu was made at that time, and then we've got the remake of Nosferatu that has just come out. So I'm really specifically Nosferatu. I love vampires and werewolves, but very specifically, I am obsessed with Nosferatu right now.
Now I have no idea. I remember seeing some of the clips and pictures of the original Nosferatu. Now, is he different than Dracula and vampire? I just kind of summed it all up as the same thing in my head. So is there a different lore around this guy?
It's an interesting lore because Nosferatu was made in, I think, 1922 by a German director who wanted to make an adaptation of Dracula but didn't have the movie rights because the book was not written. It was written in 1898 or something, I think it came out. So he didn't acquire the movie rights, just changed all the names, changed some minor plot details, and made the movie. He ended up getting sued, and they threatened a bunch of other legal action, and he was supposed to destroy every copy. But Nosferatu is interesting because it is Dracula, but it isn't Dracula because it gets made before all these preconceptions about the sexy vampire, before that becomes the thing, prior to Bela Lugosi in his 30 Dracula adaptation. So that's why I like it so much, because it's still a monster. It's not... I mean, I like Twilight, too. I'm just being honest. But, it's not the hot, desirable vampire. It's a monster that you should be scared of.
I did notice, when you look at him, he looks very different from, other Dracula and vampire genre characters, and he is more monster-like. Kind of freaks me out. What's drawn your attention to Nosferatu as a character? Is there any kind of deeper philosophical something that it says about society that you're pulling on, or is it just really cool?
I mean, it's just really cool. But also, I like horror movies because, I mean, every scary movie you watch tends to say something about our anxieties or our fears or something like that. So not just monsters, but, the whole, catalog of A24 movies, all that. So, Nosferatu specifically, given the context, so it's, during the Weimar era of Germany, and it's this time when, Nazism is just around the corner. So there's high anxiety, a lot of tension, a lot of uncertainty, and I think Nosferatu as a character reflects that because it deals a lot with, the threat of the foreign other, or the other inside society who's corrupting us, or the tension between tradition and progressivism and these sorts of things. And I find that wildly interesting.
That is, the horror genre is it can be very deep, not just slasher, but it can actually have these really in-depth plots into it. But I've never been able to do it because I have this, I don't know, it burns my soul in a way when I see things that I just can't unsee. And then for some reason, I cannot do the horror genre, even though I acknowledge that it is like a very rich genre with lots of cool things available in it. I've never been able to partake of the genre for some reason.
I understand it. I don't like slasher films that much. I will watch some movies. So Midsummer is one that I really like, even though it's extremely gruesome and kind of disturbing. But for the most part, I don't like torture porn. Like, I don't like movies where they're just blood and gore for its own sake.
I've been there too. I still have like memories of seeing things as a kid or teenager in a movie that are still burned in my brain and cause me to shudder whenever I bring them back. And sometimes it's not even from the horror genre. It was just like a torture scene or intense pain or something like that. And like it never left. And so I said, I can't watch that kind of stuff. For some reason, it hits me different. But I have a friend, his name is James, and he like dives into it and he's like, yeah, it's all fake. I can do it. It's fine. And so I understand it's there. It's pretty cool. But I've never been able to partake. So it's like some people can't do coffee because it's too bitter, but I like my coffee. It's good.
Yeah.
Well, you are this like artist, you're an academic, you're a teacher of philosophy, you're a podcaster. You do a lot of really cool things. I was just wondering, what kind of soil did your life grow out of, and how did faith, if at all, play a part in that upbringing?
I'm from that sweet, sweet Appalachian soil down in North Carolina in the mountains. And from that, I was pretty much steeped in, like, rural mountain faith, traditional, Baptist, but it's hard to define because it's so random and weird in Appalachia. Like, I tell people, if you think you know what Methodism is, or what the Baptist Church believes in, or any other denomination, Pentecostalism, if you think you know how to define that, just forget about it when you try to define it in Appalachia, because they're doing their own thing almost 100%. So I was just kind of raised in this hodgepodge of interdenominational and some non-denominational, conservative, kind of evangelical contexts. Didn't love it, however. I mean, it kind of scared me as a kid. Like, I was terrified of going to church, and I was terrified of church, and it was all, hellfire and brimstone, and kind of an entrenched Calvinism, mixed with, like, Jonathan Edwards, you are a spider at the end of a string, and God is holding you over the flame, kind of thing. But then when I was about 17 or 18, I just kind of stumbled into a sermon by a more progressive preacher who was in love with Thomas Merton. And he was talking about how the gospel said that you should be nice to people and love people, and that God, wanted to be a more intimate presence in your life, and that you were never alone, and these sorts of more affirmative ways of looking at Christianity. And I really fell in love with that. And so then the tide turned, and my opinion of theology changed quite a bit. I ended up going to Thomas Merton's monastery several times, and we can get into that, but that's kind of the general backdrop.
That's really interesting. At 17, you're exposed to some thoughts from Thomas Merton. How did you, in Appalachia, like, how did you encounter this pastor? Was he like a guest preacher somewhere? Did you wander in a church? Like, how did you encounter that?
He was just the preacher in the church that my grandparents had been going to, and I hadn't really been to church that often because I had had so much exposure to the nasty side of Christianity, that I just, once I had the agency to not go to church, I was like, I'm not going to that anymore. And it was even like, it was so bad that people in my high school would take bets about who could save me. And like, I was called, people would call me a devil worshiper and stuff, because I was just so kind of, get that away from me. I don't want it, like, but then, I just happened to walk in there on a day when he was, doing this sermon, and I kept going back and realized that was the theme of his sermons. He never preached about hell. He always openly said, yes, queer people are welcome here. He had the first female preacher I've ever heard. He had a woman pastor come. That was something that I'd never seen, because it's seen as mostly unacceptable where I'm from for women to serve in ministerial roles. So I just kept going back, and he was from the area and had grown up there, but he had grown up around an art community, where there's a bunch of hippies in the 60s, and they were also reading like Thomas Merton and Wendell Berry and some of these thinkers. So he had a similar experience where he found Thomas Merton at a young age, and then he just sort of passed it along to me.
What do you think it is about the art community that kind of broadens our perspective?
I think artists, I mean, in my experience, and I don't know if I can call myself an artist, but just in my personal experience, there's a kind of, like, something happens in your life that fuels the need to be creative as an outlet, and that fuels the need to look at things differently, or maybe artists just already come to it looking at things a little bit differently. And so the need for that outlet and the need for that expression, I think, does something interesting to a person, and does something interesting to the development of their worldview as well. And so I think you find a lot of vibrant and kind of eclectic ideas in art communities for that reason. And especially, like, I think art is almost inherently transgressive in some ways. Like, it breaks convention. And if you're breaking convention artistically, then you're going to do that ideologically at some point as well, you know?
Yeah, that's interesting. Breaking the convention, because like the convention has been built up over time, and then there's something that comes in, is introduced, and kind of questions or breaks it. Like that one preacher for you. Was there a time where it was like, not just I like what he says better than what they say, but was there a time when you're like, now I see how they had a wrong interpretation and this one is more correct? Is there more of like an intellectual understanding that you came to, or was it more kind of just I really just resonate with this more?
I think first it hit me in the heartstrings, and something about that message made me want to be better, and it filled up this kind of emptiness I was feeling. I mean, I was just one of those wayward teenagers, doesn't know what the hell they're doing, and is looking for some sort of meaning and purpose in a world where it feels like those things are more scarce. And I think for a time it just gave me a sense of like, I can go do something important. Like I can live into this gospel message. I can help people. I can be there for people. And after that, I started to get more into like the argument side of theology. So, you know, what does the Bible really mean? What is the true meaning of these gospel passages? What do other theologians and philosophers say about this? But it was an effective thing first. I mean, it hit me kind of emotionally. And then I had a need to defend that, and a need to understand what the arguments were.
Yeah, I like when we have like this intuition, and then someone comes along and gives us words for the intuition. And
yeah,
like that moment, like Thomas Merton was that for me. I picked up Inner Experience, like his final capstone work that was published posthumously. Like that was my first one that I ever read from Thomas Merton, and it took me forever to get past chapter 1 because I just kept rereading that, and I just found it so, like, it took me a couple of years to finish the book because it was like that thick. But then as of like recently, I've been noticing some of the limitations of Merton. Like if I'm going to quote Merton, like I try to make it gender neutral because he's always using like man and whatnot. Have you, I know that you loved Merton, but do you have a tension with Merton with kind of being a man of his times kind of a thing? Limitations? Did you ever run into that?
I think mostly I'm okay with Merton. I mean, we do have some disagreements because Merton is deeply committed to a personal God. There are times when he gets pretty existential, and he even talks a little bit about Paul Tillich and Paul Tillich's understanding of faith as an existential kind of pool. But throughout his life, like Thomas Merton was very convinced there is a personal God, and I've kind of abandoned that idea. So that's probably the greatest tension, is how to reconcile what Thomas Merton is saying about his, more mystical understanding of the divine, and what contemplation can do for a person, and his brand of spirituality, how to understand that in the absence of a personal God. Because that's kind of what drew me to Thomas Merton to begin with, the idea that, like, in my doubt, in my pain, someone is up there and he knows me, he or she knows me and knows everything that makes me hurt and can walk with me on this kind of treacherous journey that I'm on as a human. And I guess the second tension is like, and Thomas Merton doesn't talk about this a lot, but I think in his personal life he wasn't as advanced on the topic of like queer relationships as he probably could have been if he had lived a little bit longer. And like his confessor, Father Matthew Kelty, who knew him pretty well, was an openly gay Catholic monk, and even said, yeah, like Merton probably wasn't as good on this issue, and he would say slurs from time to time, but like maybe he would have gotten better if he hadn't died so young, you know?
Yeah, that's interesting. I had Cassidy Hall on the show a little bit ago, and she found a letter. Like the only thing Thomas Merton like ever published on that was in a letter where he said that they needed like psychiatric help or something, the queer community. Mm-hmm. And that's when she was like, I got to put this guy down and move on. But she also acknowledged the rich gifts that he gave her. So that's kind of opened my eyes to just some of the limitations, because like Merton for me in the earlier years was just like, he's like the standard, the gold standard, whatever he says is amazing. And then, and then it started to like break apart a little bit. Now you're talking about like this distinction between a personal God and not. Now, would this be where your existential philosophy comes into play? Like, we're not a philosophy show, but I really like philosophy, so we could talk about that. Yeah. But we need to do some definition of terms. Like, what do you mean when you say existentialism and personal God and these things and how they play together?
I mean, by personal God, I really just mean, you know, the typical understanding of God. And this is my problem with a lot of philosophers, is they'll say God, but they don't really mean what most people think of when they, you know, describe God. But I mean, you know, just the typical, like, there is a personal being in the cosmos who has thoughts and feelings and intuitions and knows you and created you and has some sort of relationship with you. And it's, you know, there's a variety of ways that is posited. I mean, there's like process theologians who will say that there are some limitations on God, or that God is more of a co-creator with humanity. And then, you know, there are more traditional theologians who say that God is, you know, everything, omnipresent, infinite, all-knowing, all-good, all-loving, these sorts of things. And I pretty much reject all of that and don't even use the term God anymore for talking about that, because I don't think what I believe could actually be, like, defended as a concept of God, even though Tillich tries to defend this. So I use a Tillichian understanding of divinity, and Tillich basically says that, you know, God can't be a person. God has to be the ground of everything that is, which is where we get this concept of the ground of being. So I don't like to compare it to the Force in Star Wars, but I mean, like, it's kind of more like the Force. It's almost an Eastern sense of what divinity is, like this pervasive reality that's structuring everything. It's, you know, the force that gives life to being itself, to being in general. So for Tillich, he'll say that it's the thing that protects against non-being. And I can explain that further, but it's basically just rejecting that God has personal qualities that we can, you know, talk to or empathize with. Rather, divinity is this foundational ground that gives rise to everything that exists.
I was just trying to mute this earlier because it's a new phone and I don't know how it works. So that ground of being, I know that some process philosophers and theologians would say God is both the ground of being and the fount of possibility. Mm-hmm. Would that be a Tillichian kind of a concept, or would that be adding to the ground of being?
I think there are some scholars who want to say that Tillich leaves room for there to be personal qualities with the ground of being, or for the ground of being to manifest in some sort of person-like being. I don't think that is what he meant. I think in that sense, those thinkers are kind of adding to Tillich, just because then you get into some of the, like, logical inconsistencies between both, like, a ground of everything that is, and then also from that a personality emerging. There seems to be a tension there for me.
Yeah, I mean, these stories of our Bible are very old, and then the theologies that we've built around the stories of the Bible are also very old and dated, kind of like a medieval contextualization. They're looking around at their world, and what could God be like? Well, God is obviously like the Lord in the tower, kind of a thing. I've been trying to rethink like a different contextualization for God in the modern era, and not getting very far because it's so hard with all of the things that we've learned with cosmology and quantum physics and evolutionary biology, and just all of these things have just exploded in the last 100 years, and these old medieval contexts of God just really don't fit the modern. So then the conservative says, well, we just need to not accept the new things and double down on the previous things. So I like having conversations with people like you that can at least help me see a different perspective on things. So
I mean, traditionally, there is this sense that God can be both a foundational ground and have personality. So, like, Thomas Aquinas has a concept of actus purus, or pure actuality, and he says that God is so complete that God can't have any potential to be something else because God is already perfect. So, potentiality implies incompleteness. God can't be incomplete. God is perfectly actualized. But he also talks about God as, like, the foundation of other possibilities. He just adds a personality onto that because his Christianity demands it at the time. And Augustine does the same thing, where Augustine starts out with a more kind of impersonal grounding. He draws a lot from Plato, who also said that reality springs forth from the form of the good. It's just this kind of primordial ground from everything. But then Augustine also adds personal qualities to God as well. So a lot of people start out where Tillich is, and then add a very personal kind of nature to God, which it's human. I mean, humans, have a need to anthropomorphize.
yeah, do you think that's what the Trinity doctrine kind of does? I know it makes sense of the Holy Spirit and Christ and God and monotheism. Do you think that was an attempt to kind of take this abstract divinity and then also make it personal, and then also make it something that indwells and surrounds and like almost force, like ground of being, personal deity, and empowering force? Do you think the Trinity was trying to do something with these thoughts in an early stage?
Yeah, I think that's part of the reasoning behind the Trinity. I mean, it's all, early theologians' attempts to logically make sense of this very complicated emerging theology surrounding, Jesus. So how can how can, God send himself in another form down to earth, be killed, and then also exist in the spiritual presence? And do we need to differentiate between spirit, God, and son? Well, what do those three things represent? How do they reflect different aspects of, how we're engaging with reality and with our understanding of divinity? So I think all of that, yeah.
There's a concept that I was introduced to by John Vervaeke called non-theism. Have you heard of that? And do you have any thoughts around that? Kind of as opposed to atheism or theism, or like non-theism that is kind of tied to Tillich's ground of being. Like God is not a thing, but the ground of all things.
Yeah. I've not heard that term, but it sounds, I mean, like, more of a Tillichian or ground of being attitude. I don't know, maybe you could say more about what he means there.
I wish I was smarter and and could dive into it, but it seemed like the third option for the atheism, there is no a theistic being, and then theism, there is a theistic being, and then non-theism says that God is not a being, but then the ground of all being, kind of like that found of possibility, ground of being. God is existence itself. God is, the spirit that makes life happen and consciousness happen, and almost like what you're talking about, the Force in Star Wars, but not a being as in like a personality of a person or a thing that's out in the sky and is some different supernatural realm, but more of like a force active in the world. And I'd not ever heard that term, and I was wondering if he invented that or if that is somewhere in philosophy or something.
I mean, I've never heard that term. He may have come up with that specific term in regards to his own conception of it, but I mean, the idea that there is an underlying ultimate reality. I mean, like when I talk about this to my philosophy students, I talk about it in terms of ultimacy models. So I say, like, what kind of ultimacy model do you have? Do you have an ultimacy model that has, a kind of person that's, all powerful and all knowing sitting at the center of the universe? Or do you have something more akin to like an Indian conception of ultimacy, where it's more of a force, where personality dissolves, where there's no separation between beings ultimately? There's no person controlling everything. So, agential ultimacy models and non-agential or ground of being ultimacy models is how I would describe it. But even Tillich's language can be confusing on this too, because sometimes he'll outright say, no, I reject atheism and naturalism. And when you read between the lines, you realize what he actually rejects is like atheists who will posit that, we can only find answers to things through science, or that there's no room for spirituality, or that, when we say nature is all there is, we mean there's no room for religious ideology or self-transcendence or any of these other concerns.
Like a reductionist materialism
kind of
view of the world. Yeah.
Yeah, he's rejecting reduction.
Okay. So, could you give us a little introduction to who Tillich is, Paul Tillich? I know he's like one of the existential Christian, was he theologian or just philosopher, or was he not even Christian? Give me a little intro to Tillich and who he is.
Well, every one of those questions depends on who you ask. So since you're asking me, I'll give you my answer. I think it's fine to call him, I think it's perfectly acceptable to call him a Christian theologian and philosopher. Okay. I tend to read into him more the philosophical dimensions of that, but Tillich, his most famous work is called Systematic Theology, and it's in 3 volumes, and he very much takes on the meaning of the Trinity, and he's got his own Christology, so he talks a lot about the nature of Christ, and he defines theology in reference to what the church needs. I mean, he's not, opposed to the church. He was also a minister, both, as an academic on the side, and also during World War I, he was a chaplain in the army, so he's going out into the trenches and ministering to people. So yeah, I think it's safe to say, he's both existential philosopher and a Christian theologian, but a lot of people will critique him and say he's borderline atheistic, and on those grounds, they won't listen to what he says. I think this is why Karl Barth is so much more popular than Tillich today, even though they were friends at the time. Like, they were friends for life, basically. Because Barth is more conservative and is strictly like, no, it's in the Bible. Everything goes back to Jesus. Jesus is the end-all, be-all. Just turn to Jesus, right? Christ. And Tillich is a little more nuanced in his own thought.
As soon as you involve nuance, then like dogmatics are like, no, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is why philosophy is not very popular in conservative circles, because it asks big questions that don't necessarily have answers yet.
I mean, to be fair to Karl Barth, I feel like he's probably what we would call a universalist if you get down to it. I mean, he's really not all that conservative. It's just compared to me and compared to Tillich, he seems rather conservative because he's going back to the biblical text. Mm-hmm. So,
I guess. Do you think that there is like a singular metaphysic that we can find, or do you think that we can have multiple different kinds of metaphysic that like if you were to peek under reality and find, do you think there is like this one ultimate conception that exists that we're all trying to find, or can there be multiple?
I mean, I want to say, just based on the nature of metaphysics, it'd be difficult to say that you could have competing metaphysics, since metaphysics is at root trying to get to the fundamental structures of reality. So you'd have to say, well, there are more than one kind of fundamental structure to everything that is. It's like having multiple ontologies, because then you're gonna start conflicting, and it's like, how do you describe the nature of being in these competing ways? It's kind of how I feel about ethics as well, where people will try to argue, well, this is what's good in one culture may not be good in another, and live and let live. And I just want to be like, no, like if something's wrong, it's always wrong, and it may take some people a little bit longer to get there, but it's just wrong. Like, there's a universality to that. But I do like the idea. So, like, one of the metaphors used to think about how we may be mishandling our metaphysics or not quite correct is to say, like, you've heard of the blind men touching the elephant, like that metaphor, where it's we're experiencing different aspects of the same broad reality, and no, like, one
one's
person
touching
has
the ear, one's got the tail, one's the trunk, and they're saying no, an elephant is this way, this way, this way.
Yeah. So it's like a way of understanding how we could be getting glimpses of the truth, but maybe no one person is entirely correct about what that truth is. And I think, like, I mean, even scientifically, you can think of it as, we don't yet have a theory of everything. Presumably a theory of everything exists, but right now we have different systems of physics and mathematics in order to, describe different kinds of realities and in order to work with different, aspects of existence in the cosmos and what have you.
Yeah. I think a big mistake that the conservative fundamentalist idea of Christianity does is it mistakes their systematic theology for the theory of everything metaphysic. And like, then they have the capital T truth, and they're trying to impose that upon everyone around them. And now we have, just a lot of trouble all over the place. Christian nationalism trying to get into the seven mountains and change and conquer all of society because they have the proper metaphysic and everyone else doesn't. Do you see what role, like, theology can play in constructing a metaphysic, or are they just two separate fields of thought?
I mean, I think metaphysics is inherently theological, because if you're talking about the nature of reality, and you're talking about questions that concern personhood and determinism and ultimate truth, then you're always thinking theologically, because theology is just those questions themselves. I mean, this is what keeps me in theological circles, is that theology doesn't just have to be about understanding the Trinity or what was the nature of Christ. It can be broadly, what is a good and meaningful life? And most philosophers throughout history, philosophers who were not really seen as theologians, they always have a metaphysical answer when they're trying to get at what is the best and most fulfilling life a person could pursue. That kind of way of thinking has been dropped more recently by philosophers, but like Plato and Aristotle both say you've got to understand, the nature of reality in order to understand what your purpose in this world is or what you should aspire towards.
Yeah, I think Stoicism is kind of making a comeback. I've seen that in a lot of the bro circles, trying to find like some kind of something. But then there's this existentialism that just keeps standing at the fringes and yelling into the void. Can you give us a little bit of an understanding of what existentialism is? Just a picture of how you understand it.
Yeah, I, kind of separate existentialism into two camps, and Jean-Paul Sartre, who's probably the most famous existentialist, also does this, where he says, well, there's Christian existentialists, or like, overtly religious existential thinkers, and then there's people like Sartre and de Beauvoir, his lover, who, are explicitly atheistic. And because Jean-Paul Sartre was such a prominent figure, now existentialism is wrongly understood as an inherently atheistic worldview. But Tillich was an existential philosopher who was on the fringes of that question. He didn't call himself an atheist and did prescribe to a Christian worldview, more or less. And then you have people like Soren Kierkegaard, who is pretty much a theist. I mean, I wouldn't say that he's dealing with a grounded being style understanding of the ultimate. But within their theology and philosophy, I think all existentialists are united in thinking about, the fact that even if you believe in God, like even if you follow a religious tradition, there's always this sense that the universe is not giving you something you need, some definitive answer, and that every being lives and grapples with this intense uncertainty about the future and about their own life, and this deep anxiety about, their own death and finitude. And it's not just like the fact that you will die, it's the fact that death and limitation means that there's this heightened sense of importance on what you do with your life. And we're always thinking about that in our decisions. I mean, should I do this thing or should I do this other thing? And if I do this thing, what possibilities are closed off to me because I chose wrongly? So it's those sorts of questions, and those always direct us back to, like, what is a good life? How do I make my life important? How do I find meaning?
That almost sounds like Rick Warren was attempting to offer easy answers to existentialism with this purpose-driven life kind of a thing.
Yeah. But I mean, these existential questions, they've always been a part of Christianity. Like, I always point to St. Augustine, who very early on, I mean, he doesn't start out as a Christian and just kind of finds his way there because he's asking these sorts of questions. He hits, existential crisis after existential crisis, and he arrives at a conventional Christian answer to that, which is, the love of God is what we're searching for. But it's always a fraught search. I mean, he doesn't say it's simple, you just get saved and then you're good. He thinks, actually, throughout your life, you'll need moments of reorientation because it's a constant struggle.
Yeah, and he had that existential, almost like a breakdown.
many breakdowns, yeah.
I don't know a lot about him, but I did have to read his Confessions book, and I know that there's a lot of hate in kind of progressive circles for his original sin, and then kind of his views of sexuality and all that kind of stuff. But he was also a kind of a mystic as well, kind of a... So existentialism has like this a grasp of the terrifying amount of freedom that we actually do have. Do you think that, like, we're at a level in our society with technology and social media where we just see a lot more than we ever have been, and it's causing us to, like, come face to face with this existential reality that we actually do have the freedom to either make this great or totally ruin it and break it, and now we're just, like, at each other's throats?
Yeah, I mean, Jean Paul Sartre, one of his most famous lines is, "You are condemned to be free." So, as much as we tend to, like, especially in the U.S. context, we tend to think of freedom as this empowering thing. And in reality, like, that freedom of choice is stifling at times. And, de Beauvoir, another great philosopher of existentialism, she even says, like, it doesn't matter whether you think you have good choices. As long as you have choices, you have freedom, and you have to decide. And that is also kind of stifling, because you have to think about, the ethics of the world we're building. Are we giving people the freedom to make better choices, or are we confining them to really crappy choices?
I find, like, in conservative circles, they tend to like the authoritarian models, and then say that it is the authority's job to give me a very rigid understanding of the world, which is why a lot of people really enjoy, like, the military. It's like, I don't have to think about anything. I'm told where to go and what to do, and here's your food, and here's what you wear, and here's where you sleep, and who's you're going to travel with. Everything is already defined. It's almost like an escape of existentialism, but then they embrace, like, these concepts of freedom. We have freedom that we're fighting for and all that stuff, and it almost seems contradictory to me to enter into, like, a rigid authoritarian system and then say that we have freedom. Do you think that's, like, just escaping the existential freedom that we do actually have?
I mean, I think it's an escape mechanism, and I think it's a way of, simplifying very complex things to ease our anxiety. I mean, it's why, like, when you have, and this is historically the case, this is one of the reasons I'm so interested in Weimar Germany, is that when you have moments of societal upheaval and, extreme wealth insecurity or material insecurity, so if, there's inflation, if there's economic precarity, in times of progressive reform, sometimes that can produce its own form of anxiety because traditions are being lost, and you have, no shortage of people in society who are, just pining for that tradition, that certainty that this is the way things are supposed to be. So, I mean, those are the very historical moments where authoritarianism becomes more prominent, because, a lot of people have this tendency to say, well, we need a strong man who can just, like, put things back in their place, fix things, make things simple again. I don't want this confusion or this chaos in my life. And I feel some sympathy for that, because like no one wants to be material deprived of what they need. But also, right, the answer is probably not authoritarianism there. And, most of the existentialists, this is wildly fascinating to me, most of the existential philosophers were, open socialists and were a part of reform movements and revolutions and, fought in World War II, but also, like, fought with their own home governments about these questions, because their emphasis on freedom led them to think, that this has political ramifications, that we should strive to create a world that truly is more open for people to explore different possibilities.
I've been recently kind of toying around with an idea that there is no such thing as a Christian or non-Christian nation. There is just a just or unjust nation. And that kind of gets down to those roots of what you're talking about there, I think.
Yeah, that's why I like Thomas Merton. Like, I disagree with, his final prescription of a kind of mystical theism, but honestly, like, Thomas Merton's general worldview about how we should behave and what makes for a meaningful life is much more in line with my own than many people who agree with me theologically. So, like, in some ways, whether you believe there's a personal God or not at the center of everything, doesn't necessarily reflect how you believe society should be structured, oddly enough.
Yeah, I really liked his book, Faith and Violence, where he delved into that white-collar violence that we are kind of capable of as being the greater evil than what he called the thug in the ghetto, in the alley that's going to mug you, that we're all afraid of, but then we're not afraid of, the bureaucrat behind the desk that signs a paper and then 30,000 people die, kind of a thing. That he was able to kind of see and almost speak into his world in a very prophetic kind of a way, to use the traditional term. If Thomas Merton were to kind of step into today's society, do you think he'd be saying the same things, or do you think he would kind of do some double takes? And what do you think he'd say to us right now?
I think Thomas Merton would be a radical of our time. Even in his own time, he was. I know that, like, on the queer issue, he had some places where he could have improved. But realistically, Martin Luther King Jr. and a lot of other civil rights leaders also were not, the best on this particular issue. So I think we can forgive them a little bit, especially considering most of them gave their life for important causes. And Thomas Merton is no exception to this, because, he died in, I think it was either Vietnam or Thailand, but he was visiting a Buddhist monastery. And the topic of the conversation of that day was specifically, like, Marxism and the evils of capitalism and its relationship to the Vietnam War, which he was adamantly opposed to, and had an underground writing circuit where he was opposing the war so vehemently that the American government wrote to the Abbey of Gethsemane, and they were like, you got to shut this down. We can't have him spreading this propaganda. And, in his last recorded interview or public talk, he even says Christianity is fundamentally against alienation, and capitalism causes alienation. So Christianity, by implication, should be against the dehumanizing effect of capitalism. And he thought that the war in Vietnam was just an extension of, colonialism and capitalism. So I think, like, that viewpoint, which is kind of, like, it feels pretty modern for a thinker to hold that view, I think if you put him in today's context, it would just be ramped up to the nth degree.
Yeah, sometimes I'll take a quote from him, I'll put it on screen at church during a sermon, and I'll say, tell me who said this and what the date was. And I get like 1995 or 2020, and I'm like 1940 something. Everyone just does a double take of his description of society in the 40s. And it's just like, he was very controversial in those ways. I think he would just continue to be controversial and keep moving in those directions. But he died at that. There's so much like weirdness around his death and all that. Do you have any like thoughts about how he died, or like I know there's some different thoughts out there, conspiracies of like the CIA offed him, or
Yeah,
or
there's
the
some
Vatican off them.
conspiracies.
Yeah,
There,
there's some things. Have you ever thought about that?
I have. I mean, my position on conspiracy theories is you kind of just have to learn about, just two true things the CIA has done, and every conspiracy theory then comes kind of palatable. You're like, oh, okay, that's not far-fetched at all, given what I know about what has actually happened. But there is a conspiracy theory that either the Vatican or the CIA killed him. If the Vatican did it, then it was like under the, like leadership of the CIA because he was so opposed to the Vietnam War. But I mean, I don't think so. I think it's, just as likely that it was an accident because I think he died I think the final report was a heart attack or a cardiac event because a ceiling fan got wet and there was like an electrical surge or something. I forgot the details, but it was something to do with that, which is why the conspiracy theories emerged too, because he was a young guy. He was only in his like early 50s, I think, and that is a kind of weird way to die while you're on a trip to Southeast Asia talking about the immorality of the Vietnam War at the peak of the Vietnam War,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you were to put Thomas Merton and Paul Tillich in a conversation today, what fights do you think they would have?
Probably the like nature of God. I'm sure they'd have some disagreements about that potentially, but honestly, I think if you just had them sit down and talk about a political issue, they'd probably be more or less on the same page. I mean, Thomas Merton was very faithful in his Catholicism even to the end somehow, even though he seemed to contradict every like major tenet of Catholicism at some point in his monastic life. Merton, I think, was good at finding the loopholes. He was good at arguing. I mean, he had an affair with a woman, basically, as a monk. And, he said he promised he never consummated the affair, but he also didn't apologize for it. He said, "I know, actually, this showed me the greater depth of God's love." But I think it would be along those lines. Because Paul Tillich also, he was in an open relationship. And I think, they might argue about chastity and the limits of what the church can dictate in terms of how one uses one's body and those sorts of things. Maybe. I mean, that's like assuming Thomas Merton stayed true to his Catholic roots. He might, at this point, Thomas Merton may have just like gone off into the backwoods of Appalachia and said, screw it all. I'm done.
Be another John the Baptist. Like, I'm just going out to the desert. I'm done. Well, it feels like we're in like a post-truth kind of society that lacks a shared narrative. How might one go about finding a shared narrative in a pluralistic society that doesn't create margins for excluded folks?
Oh, yeah, that's super difficult to answer. I mean, I've tried to do some of that with my YouTube channel, and my podcast. Not that I'm going to shed, ultimate truth on the world or anything, but I suppose I would just encourage more people to, interrogate their own beliefs. I think part of why we live in such a post-truth society is because we have so much information coming at us at any given moment, and we don't really know how to examine it. I mean, even I get caught up in bullshit all the time where something seems so true, and if I think about it for 2 seconds or I actually bother to look it up, it's it's not true at all. And with the introduction of like deep fakes and what AI can do at this point, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And so I wonder if you don't get past that by just learning how to think better, which is like part of what draws me to Thomas Merton's contemplative method or emphasis on contemplation is to get back at that deep interiority where we're actually not only thinking about like, is this true, is this verifiable in a very logical way, but where we're trying to think about like, what do we want, what is it that like would speak to us at the deepest level. It's almost like you've heard of people talk about how they drop acid and then they just see everything is interconnected and it changes their world. I think that's what Thomas Merton was trying to get at, just without the acid, that you could get into these, meditative, contemplative states. You could live your life in a contemplative manner, and you could see, God embodied in everybody on earth, and you could treat them accordingly. I don't know. That was a lot. I don't know if that answers your question. I don't think there's one answer. I think it's like a change in how we live our life
Yeah.
that
And
that
kind of
needs to happen. Yeah.
just learning how to examine our life and examine what we believe, how we adopted it, and why, I think is really important. And a lot of people don't want to go back to the source of where we got the information. They just want to believe that the authority was valid. And I think the deconstruction movement is really looking at some of the sources of the information that was handed to us about religion and just saying, I'm not so sure if this was valid when it was given to me. And then that scares a lot of the conservative folks who want to conserve, those traditional methods of believing and behaving in the world. But we're moving into this pluralistic society that's really hard to maintain a shared narrative, and we're finding lots of problems with it.
Yeah. I mean, my hope is, we can all have our Thomas Merton experience where, I don't know if you know the story of him in Louisville.
Oh, yeah.
Because he was a hermit. Yeah, I mean, he was a hermit for many years, and he just wanted to escape the world and go right and be closer to God, so to speak. And he talks about this experience where he was standing on that corner, and he says, suddenly I saw everyone shining just like God does. And that was like the moment where he realized, finding God or finding the infinite or finding the ultimate is not going to be captured by going to the woods and isolating myself. It's going to be found by like searching the depths of myself and seeing, other people as co-constituting who I am, which is actually a very existential point that like you're free, but your freedom has something to do with other people's freedom, with who other people are, with the joys that other people bring you.
Yes. That walnut and fifth. I've sometimes when I'm like reading social media, I'm just praying for it to happen for me. I'm like reading the comments on a YouTube video, and I'm like, I need a walnut and fifth moment right now because these people are stupid. That's what I'm thinking. I just honestly.
I understand it can be very difficult. Very difficult.
Yeah, you mentioned AI and technology and just making things harder. With that fast pace of its growth, I think it's growing faster than we can integrate it into like society, and we've been probably there for a while. What does the next 10 years look like from your perspective if we look at how we're handling the technology we have and yet how it's outpacing our ability to integrate it into our shared existence?
Yeah. I do a little bit of research on this, and I was just on another podcast talking about AI and video games, and my final answer is really that like I'm not really scared of the technologies. I'm scared of humans, and I'm scared of the incentives of our economic system. I think historically most fears in regards to technology have been really fears about how they're used rather than fears about just the technology. Even when you deal with like chemical warfare or nuclear power or any of these things, it's not, I mean, the technology itself is kind of value neutral, but it's like how humans are going to use it. How are they going to develop it? And, right now with AI, I think the problem we're dealing with is not necessarily the idea that the threat that the technology is going to become sentient and kill us all. It's more or less just like, are the problems of capitalism that already exist going to be exacerbated? Like, are we going to create technologies that can just, reduce the need for most of the workers in the world? And if that happens, what's that going to mean? Like, what kind of crises is that going to cause when everyday people have even less power than they did? So, I mean, that's my thought on that. It is advancing at a pretty rapid rate, but I think it's advancing in one direction over the other because of the way people tend to use it. And they tend to use it in a way that maximizes profit, not in a way that maximizes human well-being.
Yeah, I like how you talked about getting at the incentives of the capitalistic mechanism. And I really like Andrew Yang's thoughts around that, of changing the political system by changing the incentives that are in it. So I've been listening to some of his thoughts. I guess last question for you before I let you go, but how might we shift this towards a better outcome? What advice do you have for us?
Oh, I don't know what advice I could give on this. I think online people will often say, go touch grass. Get off the internet and go touch grass. And I think on some level that's true. I mean, I do engage in some pretty robust online communities, and they are a significant point of connection to me. So, like my podcast and stuff, I don't just do that because I want to be a cool podcaster. Like, I enjoy the people I get to talk with, and I enjoy listening to my friends have conversations with all these other cool people on their podcasts. But I do, I think there's a limit to that as a source of connection, and I do believe people need to go out more into their communities, which is really difficult because just the nature of how we've structured our society is that there are so few places where you can just go to be with people without having to pay to enter, without community being market driven. And even online, sometimes I find myself, having to ask myself, am I doing this because I want to get this message out, or because I want to engage in a conversation, or am I doing this because I think it's going to feed the algorithm and that's going to lead to monetary success and I'm going to be better off for it? And so, I mean, that's kind of where I am, is I'm trying to tell myself, think about why you're doing things. Like, what is your actual reason for doing this thing over another thing? Is it for, are you using this as a means to an end, or is it just an end in itself? Like, are you writing this piece because you think it's valuable, or because you think it's going to lead to your success in some, material way? And then I also, I try to go out and be with people and do things just because they're joyful. I think more of us should do that.
I like that. I noticed that in how I started this podcast. I was kind of like, well, I have stuff to say and I want to say it, so I need a platform. And then I started to realize, like, I really need a lot more education. I need to learn a lot more. And so I started to invite people on the show that I was like, I think I can learn something from them. And then I think people can just listen in on my ongoing education. And so that's become like this, it's a fun hobby that I do, that I get to learn about all these different perspectives and talk to all these different people. And it's been fun. So thanks for being one of those people and coming on and teaching me some stuff.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me on. This was fun.
Yeah. Well, where can people connect with your work? Where do you want to send them?
I run a YouTube page called Bitegeist.
Which is the greatest name. I was just like, that is so good.
I thought it was kind of clever. I'm primarily known for my Tillich podcast, Tillich Today, but on the YouTube channel, all the podcasts and all the videos are just there, so they can find all my stuff on that side. And then I also run a pretty popular Instagram page just under the name Tillich Today. But if you type in Tillich Today or Bitegeist, you'll find me somewhere on the internet.
All right. Well, I'll make sure to put those in the show notes.
Awesome.
Well, Taylor, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was a really rich conversation.
Yeah, thank you.